Welcome. Hello and welcome to City Breaks Amsterdam, Episode 9, Van Gogh, the Man and the Museum. So a whole episode devoted to the artist so inextricably entwined with the city of Amsterdam, even though in fact he only lived there for a relatively short period. I'm Marion Jones. Amsterdam is the 14th city that I've covered. If you didn't know that, I hope you might feel inspired to go back and have a look for one or two of the others. And this episode, number 9, is the second of a pair devoted to the artistic delights of Amsterdam. Last time we covered the Rijksmuseum, and today it's the turn of the painter who's got a museum all to himself in Amsterdam. One Vincent van Gogh, dates 1853 to 1890. And this episode is going to start with some biographical details, then focus on the museum, the Van Gogh Museum, and finish with a little mini section on 3 other places in the city you might like to visit if your focus is on the modern and the contemporary in the art world. So then, turning first to the man himself, who died aged only 37, and who, for the first 16 years or so of his life, didn't particularly show signs that he was going to devote his life to art. He did a bit of drawing here and there, not really anything much that people thought back and talked or wrote about. When he was 16, however, he got his first job working for an art dealer in The Hague, and that was when he began collecting prints and reproductions. He did a lot of travelling. They sent him to London, which he didn't really like, where in fact he became depressed. And so, having taken an interest in art, he turned his attention to something completely different, theology. So began the period which he did spend living in Amsterdam in 1877, when he moved there to study theology. He did, in fact, leave us quite a painterly description of the city, an extract from one of his many, many letters to his brother Theo, in which he described it thus: "Twilight is falling. That little avenue of poplars and their slender forms and thin branches stand out so delicately against the grey evening sky. Further down is a little garden, and the fence around it with the rose bushes, and everywhere in the yard the black figures of the workmen and of a little dog. In the distance the masts of the ships in the dock can be seen, and just now, here and there, the lamps are being lit." He was not, however, very happy in Amsterdam, for a couple of reasons. He didn't like where he was living, with an uncle, a rather rigid ex-military type, who, I think it's fair to say, did not think much of his errant nephew. And secondly, Vincent didn't really enjoy the studies either. In fact, he wrote about it: "What could be more oppressive than Greek lessons in the heart of Amsterdam, in the heart of the Jewish quarter, on a hot and stifling afternoon, with the feeling that many difficult examinations await you, arranged by very learned and shrewd professors." He set off again to Brussels this time, to a training school for evangelists, where he did a trial period, but where in fact they decided in the end not to take him on. That was followed by a period in a coal mining district of Belgium, working as a lay preacher, and it seemed to be here that his interest in art became serious again. He visited lots of galleries. At one point he wrote a list of, quote, 50 artists whose work I like very much indeed. Top of the list were 2 French artists, Millet and Daubigny, both of whom painted scenes of rural life, and that was the direction in which his interest was moving. He started buying prints and covering the walls of his room with them to, as he put it, get new ideas and freshen my mind. He began teaching himself painting, drew obsessively. His brother Theo also worked for an art dealer, sent him various prints which he copied and copied. He got hold of a 2-volume drawing course and copied everything in it twice, so that's 60 old master drawings. He studied anatomy and perspective, and he wrote to his brother, "I couldn't tell you how happy I feel to have taken up drawing again." By this stage, we're in 1880, when he was 27, at which point he began to formalise his art, moving back to Brussels, taking drawing lessons at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and writing in 1883, so at the age of 30, "My plan for life is to make paintings and drawings as many and as well as I can." 2 years after that, he completed a work called The Potato Eaters, a large and challenging canvas with 5 main figures, which he said had been a formidable fight. He'd done months of preparatory studies for it, and when he finally finished it, he was pleased with it, though his brother Theo thought it was too dark and gloomy. I'll be coming back to this painting in a few minutes. There followed a short period at Antwerp for the art school there, and then in 1886, the most significant move, he went to Paris. I think because of the reputation of its artists. He settled in with his brother Theo in Rue Le Pic, which is in Montmartre, and started mixing with artists. Famous ones, Gauguin, Pissarro, Toulouse-Lautrec, working with them, spending time with them, eventually exhibiting a few of his paintings in one of the cafes in Montmartre, and writing of this period that he'd got to know, quote, 20 or so painters whom people call impressionists. The majority of them are poor souls who live in coffee houses, lodge in cheap inns, and live from one day to the next. And the key word in that quotation, impressionists, is a reminder that this is where he started to find painters who were doing things really very differently from anything he'd ever seen before. One of his early descriptions of Impressionism used the words careless, ugly, and badly painted, but actually soon he began to admire the bright colours and loose brushstrokes of all these artists. To think that maybe the Dutch painting he was used to was old-fashioned compared to them. And he felt inspired to experiment himself. Lots of self-portraits followed, and still lifes of flowers full of bright colours, Parisian scenes, of the cafes and the parks, of street scenes like the Boulevard de Clichy. He was only in Paris for some 2 years, but it was a key phase in his development as an artist. He moved on then again to the south of France, to Arles, where his dream was to establish a similar sort of artistic community, a band of brothers, if you will, who would thought like him and would share his life and his artistic endeavours. And the south of France was another revelation. As one of the information panels in the museum puts it, there, struck by the bright light and shimmering colours, his paintings grew brighter. From this period date the orchards in full bloom, colourful country scenes painted at harvest time, pictures of local olive groves and wheat fields and sunflowers. Here's the guidebook to the museum. Quote, in Arles, his painting and drawing style reached full maturity, a personal, expressive manner of painting with dashes of thick paint, often somewhat roughly and jaggedly applied, and sometimes using swirling lines. He moved his brush across the canvas freely and dynamically, in a way that was powerful and never repetitive. It was the artist Paul Gauguin who later termed this as the essential Vincent style. Indeed, it was Gauguin that Van Gogh invited to come and join him in Arles, to make a start on founding the artistic community he had in mind, something he wanted to call the Studio of the South. He was so excited about Gauguin's arrival that he decorated the room that he was going to sleep in, including putting up paintings of his sunflowers. The two men lived and worked together, but their relationship was characterized by fierce differences in approach, particularly about painting. They had big arguments about which Vincent once said, "We sometimes emerge from this with tired minds, like an electric battery after it's run down." Gauguin added, "In general, we agree about very little, especially painting." For Van Gogh, there followed a period of ill health, a time when he didn't eat properly, he drank heavily, he began to have seizures, and the arguments with Gauguin worsened and came to a head one evening when, Gauguin claimed anyway, Vincent threatened him with a razor, and when, as the guidebook puts it, later that evening Van Gogh cut off most of his own left ear. He wrapped it in newspaper and presented it to a prostitute in the nearby red light district. So really a proper breakdown, after which Gauguin telegrammed to Theo in Paris and implored him to come and visit and see what could be done. And the result was that Vincent was taken to a hospital at nearby Saint-Rémy, where he was given a room of his own and allowed to use a little room next door as a studio, and where he began painting almost immediately. The garden and the view from his window. One of his paintings from this period is actually called Garden of the Asylum, about which one of the information panels says, "The tiny figure in the overwhelming landscape reinforces the existential dread Van Gogh wished to convey." Vincent himself, writing about painting from the room, wrote, "Through the iron-barred window I can make out a square of wheat in an enclosure, above which in the morning I see the sun rise in its glory." So a feverish period of painting followed, and then he discharged himself and moved nearer to Paris, to Auvers-sur-Oise, on the recommendation of his brother Theo, who knew a doctor there, whom he hoped would keep an eye on Vincent. His depression, however, persisted. He wrote, "My life is attacked at the root." But another period of really intense work followed. He was there some 70 days, during which he painted at least 75 works, firing off letters to his brother requesting more canvas. But it was not the recovery that everyone had hoped for, quite the reverse, because one hot afternoon in July that year, Vincent left the house, set off across the fields with a revolver, and shot himself in the chest, dying of his injuries 2 days later. He was buried in Auvers. His brother Theo inherited all his work, although he too died just a few months later, and it was his wife Johanna who looked after the work and began his legacy, organising exhibitions, selling some of his paintings, publishing all his letters, all of which began to establish his reputation, which grew and grew and grew some more all through the 20th century. So, the museum then, the Van Gogh Museum, on Museumplein in southern Amsterdam. It holds the world's largest collection of Van Gogh's paintings and drawings, 200 or so paintings, 500 drawings, almost all the letters. As the wording on the website puts it, in the museum's permanent exhibition, you will step directly into Vincent van Gogh's world. You obviously see his masterpieces, such as Sunflowers, Almond Blossom, Bedroom, and the Potato Eaters, but also his drawings and letters, and you will discover the ideas and ambitions behind his art. The museum opened in 1973, commissioned 10 years earlier by the government as a place to showcase all the work still held in Amsterdam, which had come down from Johanna, Vincent's sister-in-law, through her son, also called Vincent, and then after his death had been displayed in the Stedelijk Museum, just opposite where the Van Gogh Museum stands today, until it was finally decided that a new museum should be dedicated to all of this treasure. There have been a number of renovations, new wings added, etc., all of which mean that when you go today, it's a light, bright, airy museum, large in scope, even though it's focusing very much really on one person, and just the place to lose yourself in Van Gogh and his work. I thought I'd run through a few of the highlights to look out for, starting with one of the early rooms in which are displayed lots and lots of his self-portraits. So, again, one subject matter, but really quite different one from another, as described on one of the information panels. Green eyes, a red beard, a furrowed brow, a blue work smock. Sometimes he wears a hat, and at others he smokes his favourite pipe. They are, read the text, all recognisable as Vincent, yet different each time. And it points out that they weren't really meant to show exactly what he looks like. They were more doubtless exercises in colour and brushwork. Take, for example, the self-portrait with grey felt hat, painted in 1887, so just at the end of his time in Paris, in which you can very much see the influence of the pointilliste with whom he'd been mixing. Their work was often done with little dots of colour, and this self-portrait is short stripes of paint in different directions and all different colours. Very different, a little later on you'll come across the Potato Eaters, the painting from 1885, so before his time in Paris and his discovery of all the wonderful possibilities of colour. At that period he was very interested in peasant life, seeing it as wholesome and real, and writing to Theo, "I desire nothing other than to live deep in the country and to paint peasant life." He wanted to capture the peasants' coarse faces, their bony working hands, the dignity of the work that they did. He wanted, he said, to show that they have, quote, tilled the earth themselves with these hands that they are putting into the dish, that they have thus honestly earned their food. And he went on to write, The colour they're painted now is something like the colour of a really dusty potato, unpeeled of course. He also said that he wanted the painting itself to smell of, quote, bacon, smoke and potato steam. So it was a really carefully thought out work with which he was very pleased, although others criticised it and said the colours were too dark, prophesying that it would never sell. From the Paris period, look out for some of the so-called Montmartre paintings, so the ones that he painted when he lived in that area of the city. So they date from 1886 and 87 and include, for example, the Boulevard de Clichy, that being one of the main streets in the Montmartre district, very close to where Van Gogh himself lived, so a corner that he knew really well. Then there's View from Theo's Apartment, a painting showing the apartment blocks that he could see looking out of the window, painted with small dots of colour, so Vincent experimenting with the technique that he'd learnt from the Pointilliste. The paintings from his period in Arles and Saint-Rémy are different again, capturing the dryness and the heat of the flat landscape around the city of Arles, where he settled. Often colourful works, azure blue skies, yellows and greens for the land. He spent days at a time working in the wheat fields under the burning sun. His pictures are full of half-mowed wheat fields and ladders and carts. And, of course, the workers, a solitary reaper in a field, for example. Another really well-known painting from this period is called The Yellow House, a picture of the house where he and Gauguin lived in the centre of Arles, about which he wrote, "My house here is painted outside in the yellow of fresh butter, with garish green shutters, and it's in the full sun on the square, where there's a green garden of plane trees, oleanders, acacias, and the intense blue sky above. Inside I can live and breathe and think and paint." He did a picture too called The Bedroom at Arles, a painting of his actual bedroom. A simply furnished room with a wooden floor, but decorated with bright colours that he'd come to love, yellows and red. It was one of his favourite works, about which he wrote to Theo, "When I saw my canvases again after my illness, what seemed to me the best was the bedroom." It's also from this period that the sunflower paintings date. Large canvases with sunflowers in a vase, painted in 3 or 4 shades of yellow and, as he put it, nothing else. He had hung 2 of them in the bedroom he was preparing for his friend Paul Gauguin to live in, about which Gauguin said the style was completely Vincent. Also from this period, in early 1890, Almond Blossom, large blossom branches against a bright blue sky, a painting celebrating new life, painted at just the moment when his brother Theo and wife Johanna had their baby son, named after Vincent, and it was a work which always stayed in the family and was one of their most treasured possessions. And just nearby some of his last paintings, the rather disconcerting wheat field with a reaper, based on the scene he could see through the window of the asylum in Saint-Rémy, and beautifully described in a book called Waiting for Past Years by the Spanish writer César Antonio Molina, who wrote, quote, "The reaper is a dark painting full of symbolism. The wheat is being harvested. The sun is still out but is about to descend. It has lost its force and colour and is soon to be devoured by the mountains. The peasant, a small figure, barely relevant in the midst of nature and the landscape, holds a sickle in his right hand. He is at the centre of a sea of wheat. Yellow takes up almost the entirety of the canvas, excepting the fence and the background, with its brown hills, expressing the extreme heat of the day, solitude and silence. There is too the equally unsettling wheat field with crows, painted in July 1890, so in the very last weeks of Van Gogh's life. A windswept wheat field with a central path that seems to be leading nowhere, and a dramatic sky filled with crows flying over the wheat field, birds which Vincent himself had said to his brother were a symbol of death. Some have claimed that this was the very last painting he did, although I think today people think it's more likely to have been one called Tree Roots, also in the museum. I don't think the truth is certain, but the art historians, Walther and Metzger, who wrote Van Gogh The Complete Paintings, said this: "There's nothing in Van Gogh's words to support a simplistic interpretation along the lines of artistic angst and despair. nor is there any evidence for the widely held belief that it was this painting that Van Gogh had on his easel at the time he killed himself. It's also worth saying that although most of the museum is of course dedicated to Van Gogh and his work, there are paintings by other artists there, including artists he admired and based some of his work on. There's Vineyard Labourer, for example, by Jean-François Millet, and there's a Daubigny painting called October, a rural landscape. Then there are pictures of Impressionist artists by whom he was influenced. Pissarro's haymaking, for example, works by Toulouse-Lautrec and the Pointilliste Seurat. There are Japanese prints, which he collected and sometimes copied. So, for example, hanging together, a Japanese print called Flowering Plum Orchard, and Vincent's work based on it, very similar but not quite the same. So, very definitely then, of all the museums worldwide, the place to really get to know Vincent van Gogh, his work and his life. He only really spent just over a decade painting, but in that time he created over 2,000 works, 860 oil paintings, most of them dating from the last 2 years of his life. And really, it's quite incredible to think that while he was alive, only one of his paintings sold, a lesser-known one called The Red Vineyard. When he killed himself, he was virtually unknown. I think one article had been published about him. He'd shown a few of his canvases in independent galleries in Paris, but it was only really after his death, and thanks to the efforts of his sister-in-law, that people began to appreciate his work. That's really quite incredible when you consider that today his works are among the most expensive paintings ever sold anywhere in the world. To sum up what it is that represents his legacy, perhaps the word that will keep coming back is colour. His experiments with it, his interest in it, his knowledge of colour theory, the way he combined complementary colours in his paintings, so matching colours from the opposite sides of the colour wheel so that each intensified the other. Look out for the red and green combination, or yellow and violet, or blue and orange. It really was a key focus for him, illustrated in the museum actually by a box which they've got, in which he kept balls of wool so that he could put them next to each other and see what the effect of one colour on another was. I turned to a couple of places in search of a summary of his legacy. The Encyclopaedia Britannica put it like this: largely on the basis of the works of the last 3 years of his life, Van Gogh is generally considered one of the greatest Dutch painters of all time. His work exerted a powerful influence on the development of much modern painting. And then, why not, as an experiment, I asked AI what it thought. Here's what it came up with. Vincent van Gogh's legacy is multifaceted, encompassing his enduring artistic influence, the romanticised myth of the tortured artist, and the enduring popularity of his work. While not widely recognised during his lifetime, his distinctive style, characterised by bold colours and expressive brushwork, profoundly impacted subsequent art movements like Expressionism and Fauvism. Why yes, indeed. And just to finish off the episode, I wanted to mention 3 more museums in Amsterdam which you could look out for if art really is your thing. I've devoted quite a lot of time to the 2 biggies, the Rijksmuseum and the Van Gogh Museum. I didn't actually get to any of these 3 places, but I can tell from what I've read that if that really is the focus of your visit, they're places well worth checking out. The first one is the Stedelijk Museum, just near the Van Gogh Museum, an intriguing building known as the Bathtub locally, a museum of modern and contemporary art from 1870 to the current day, featuring, for example, Picasso, Matisse and Marc Chagall, Mondrian and Rothko. One of those places where the permanent exhibition is worth visiting anyway, but so very much are the succession of temporary exhibitions and events which take place all through the year. A couple of possibilities to help things along. They offer an Essentials tour, which is basically an app that you can download, and thanks to which, says the website, you can easily visit all the must-see essentials of our collection. Also, there's an audio tour, something to help you look at the works on display through the eyes of artists and designers who tell you why they created the piece and what it means to them, with quotes too from curators who say exactly why they chose a particular piece of work and how it fits into the whole concept of the museum. Secondly then, the strangely named NDSM Loods. NDSM is the district of Amsterdam, right up in the north of the city around the harbour, where a former shipyard has been repurposed on the banks of the River Eye to create a huge high-ceilinged post-industrial space, which is now home to an artistic community and one which you can walk into and look around. It is a private space, but they say they have an open-door policy any time from 9 till 6 and free to enter. You can walk round, you can see 80 or so workspaces in which over 200 artists have little studios. You can watch them at work, you can see their work, and running alongside all of that, a whole programme of events, music and theatre performances, exhibitions, dance events, markets, all sorts of different things. And the third place I'd recommend is called Straat, which I think might be the Dutch for street, the world's largest museum of graffiti and street art, another former warehouse, instantly recognisable because there's a massive picture of Anne Frank on the outside of the building, a colourful street art version of her. Inside, 150 or so works for you to have a look at. Again, options for getting the most out of it. So, for example, they do guided tours. Would you like, says the website, to visit Straat and have someone by your side to answer all your questions about street art and graffiti? Or, if you're more about having a go than just looking at other people, you might like to go to one of their graffiti workshops and, quote, experience what it's like to work with a spray can yourself. They start, we are told, with an explanation of the techniques, and then, quote, it's time to get busy yourself on the large shipping containers next to the museum. Our experienced workshop instructor will provide tips and tricks. Don't forget to take a photo of your own masterpiece at the end. So there you have it, 3 ideas for following up art in Amsterdam in slightly less conventional ways than the 2 big museums. That's it then as far as art in Amsterdam goes, and in the next episode I'm moving on to a double whammy of an episode. 2 topics which are both absolutely intrinsic to Amsterdam's history, 2 of its most intriguing stories if you like. An episode which I'm going to call Tulips and Diamonds. And as per usual there'll be a little history on each, something about their significance today, and a sprinkling of museums and other places to visit to find out more. So, I hope you'll tune in for that. Meanwhile, it just falls to me to sign off in Dutch, which I'm still not super confident about doing, but I believe if I say hartelijk dank, that means thank you very much, and I can wish you goodbye with just 2 syllables, namely, tot ziens.